to our next presentation, and that's Dale Bugan, who's the Vice President of Research and Analysis for the Canadian Institute for Climate Change. Mr. Bugan, the process that we use, you have 20 minutes to make your presentation, which will be followed by 40 minutes of questions, 10 minutes from each party. And you're currently, okay, good. The floor is now yours.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair, and thank you, committee, for having me here. My pleasure to join you today. I am the Vice President of Research at the Institute for Climate Choices. I'll go to the next slide, actually, Patrick. We'll keep it moving. So a brief message about who we are. We are a pan-Canadian research organization. We're funded by the federal government, but entirely independent in our research, in our analysis, and most importantly, in our policy advice. We are governed around 3 expert panels from academics and experts and policy researchers from across the country that are at the top of their fields across adaptations, that is preparing for warming climate, mitigation, how to reduce emissions, and clean growth, how to prosper and grow well-being in the face of those climate change and climate transitions. We are a pan-Canadian organization, which means we look at Canada as a whole. That means today I'll be drawing on research we published over the last 2 years that is often national in scope, but often regional in resolution. Wherever I can, I will bring in New Brunswick specific details, New Brunswick specific data. And that is me as an outsider doing my best to recognize that context and circumstances are certainly different across the country and unique in New Brunswick in lots of ways. Let's go to the next slide. I'm going to cut this in 3 stories, 3 different sections. We'll start with what we in research land call adaptation, that is preparing for a changing climate, building resilience, but also recognizing that the impacts of a changing climate are economic issues, are social issues, are issues that cannot be ignored and need to be kind of internalized in a very deep way across lots of policy decisions at lots of orders of governments, including New Brunswick. Let's go to the next slide to start that story. Over the last 2 years, we've produced 3 major reports and are still working on a few more in a series on the costs of climate change, trying to put numbers and analysis behind the idea that a changing climate has huge risks and huge implications for economies, for regions, for sectors across the country. Those stakes are extremely high and they merit policy attention. They are also very cross-cutting and have huge implications in lots of different ways. Everything from property damage from floods and for sea level rise, from health implications, from heat wave, from permafrost affecting the north. These are just a few of the many impacts that really matter in internalizing how important climate change is for long-term prosperity. Maybe most importantly, though, is how much we don't know. There's lots of information and lots of analysis about the cost of climate change that we have quantified. There is even more to be done assessing those risks that are hard to quantify, that are not yet internalized, or even worse, that are black swans that are not yet on the radar screen. So these long-term disruptive impacts, whether it is business disruption and supply chains, we saw some of this in BC this summer for the first time in a serious way, international impacts from impacts elsewhere in the world, or cascading effects from one disaster affecting a second disaster, affecting a third disaster. Again, those are increasingly moving from the abstract to the concrete in light of what we saw in British Columbia this summer with heat waves, forest fires and floods, all interacting and compounding on each other, exacerbating the risk. Again, these are risks that must be managed, but we have to be looking beyond the risks we understand to also thinking about what else is on the horizon. Next slide, please. The Institute has started to do some of that work to explore what lies beneath the surface on that iceberg of climate risks. We put out a detailed work within the last year on the implications for infrastructure of a changing climate. That piece of work explored the costs of flooding on buildings and other built infrastructure. It explored road damage and delay from various climate hazards. It explored impacts on electricity infrastructure from storm, but also from warming. This, again, is just the tip of the iceberg. There are all kinds of other infrastructure impacts from a changing climate that have to be part of our policy-making decision conversations. Nevertheless, even what we have quantified are hugely significant costs. I've given you just a snapshot in the slide here. This is a look at our forecast and analysis drawing on some fairly comprehensive modeling of inland flooding impacts in New Brunswick. This reflects damages to homes and to buildings, for example, from the St. John River and Fredericton, having huge implications on an annual basis and huge risks on an annual basis for buildings. Part of this is affected, and the nature of those risks are affected by the emissions trajectories that the world is on. The more the world emits, the more we trend towards that high emissions world. But as you can see, lots of these risks and these costs are baked in from warming that is already going to happen based on historical emissions. Yes, there's an imperative to make sure it doesn't get worse. We also need to be preparing at the same time for the warming that's coming no matter what. I'm not going to elaborate too much more other than to note that there's lots more in this paper that I'm skating over, from buckling roads and degrading, from the cost of road repair, from the cost of road delay. They could more than triple in New Brunswick over the next 30 years, unless we are designing roads to be designed for those future climates, internalizing the fact that the climate is changing, and that's changing the parameters for how we make decisions about infrastructure. Notable as well that some of those investments could actually reduce road repair and replacement costs below what's spent today. So there's opportunities for very cost-effective investments in resilience. Next slide, please. A second report on the cost of climate change that we put out this year explored the health implications. And we looked at implications of heat waves for productivity, on the economy, for implications of health waves on health and death, implications on of heat and ground level ozone, that's local air pollution exacerbated by heat, for illness and for death, and for increased prevalence of Lyme disease from a changing climate. Again, these costs are extremely significant at a national scale, and that's true at a local level as well. The results here are Canada-wide, but if you start to unpack those at a regional level, we're looking at additional increases of annual deaths, specifically 25 additional deaths every year by mid-century from some of these heat threats, unless we take action to be proactive and avoid some of these damages. There's a click here, Patrick, just to click through this once. There we go. Those risks increase over time significantly. The need to be proactive and to prepare for this increased warming is a pretty strong imperative that you see from those costs of climate change. But there are solutions out there, and New Brunswick is already advancing some of those solutions. I'll make 3 recommendations on the adaptation front. The first is to embed climate risks and those benefits of preparing for those climate risks throughout government decision-making. Climate change affects not one thing, but all things in the economy, whether it's health, whether it's infrastructure, whether it's transportation systems, whether it's supply chains. As a result, being proactive and preparing for that changing climate isn't the job of one department, it's the job of all departments. Isn't the job of one order of government, it's the job of multiple orders of government. That makes this a governance challenge in lots of ways, and there's a need to explicitly require policy decisions, whether they are investments in infrastructure or investments in social safety nets, to be explicitly considering the benefits of baking in climate resilience into those decisions. The private sector has the same need to make those different decisions all through the economy, reflecting the cost of a changing climate and the benefits of preparing for it. One of the best ways to do that and to enable that private sector to take action to prepare for a changing climate is to provide the information they need to make those decisions. New Brunswick is a leader as of the last few weeks on flood mapping, on giving information about where flood risks are greatest, and that helps to inform decisions about where to build and values of properties, and to make those decisions in a way that is not just anticipating costs and benefits right now, but costs and benefits into the future, even in the face of those climate risks. That's one step. There are others that we can make. to again make sure that that information about climate risk is penetrating through lots of different decisions. Ultimately, the costs we've talked about are not going to be borne equally across all people, across all communities, across all regions, and that those that are most vulnerable from other factors, whether it is income or race or other factors that make them more exposed to these risks, more vulnerable to these impacts, makes them most affected by the changes we're talking about. As a result, building safety nets to protect those vulnerable to all shocks, including climate shocks, can pay big dividends in terms of building longer-term resilience to climate change. Next slide, please. Let me pivot to the need to reduce emissions, the need to contribute to net zero emissions to make sure that those climate change impacts don't get even worse over time, don't exacerbate the warming that we already have. New Brunswick, like all jurisdictions, has a role to contribute to reducing global emissions. Next slide. This is a study that others you've talked to may have alluded to already, but it explores pathways to net zero for Canada. And we wanted to make sure we're looking at pathways that are internally consistent, that exist. A pathway does exist from here to 2030 targets and on to 2050 net zero. And we used an economic model to make sure that we were not using any magical thinking. We leaned into the idea at the same time that there is uncertainty on the way to net zero. We explored more than 60 scenarios looking at different dimensions of uncertainty. Interestingly, across that set of scenarios, two kinds of solutions emerged. One is safe bets, those solutions that occur again and again across every scenario, relying on solutions and technologies that are already available, are already being deployed, and are already at scale. In 2030, to achieve the 2030 target nationally, those safe bets are by far the most important and contribute at least 2/3 of the emissions reductions required. They include things like electric vehicles, methane capture, first generation biofuels in some cases. Next slide. By 2050, the story flips a little bit. The technologies that are not yet available, that may become huge players on pathways to net zero, but also may not pan out and may not scale at cost, are much more important. These wildcards are part of the 2050 story. And the importance of the wildcards for achieving net zero highlights the need not just to deploy existing technologies, but also to drive innovation to create the low carbon technologies and net zero technologies of the future. Next slide. I'm unpacking a few New Brunswick specific results from those scenarios to explore a little bit about what the pathways to net zero in the province look like, as well as where uncertainty still remains. This is home heating, and you can see there's some really big shifts in home heating in the province if it is to walk a net zero pathway. You're still seeing a prevalence of electric baseboard heating to some extent, but you're seeing existing furnaces mostly replaced by heat pumps. That's a net zero electric technology that can provide both heating and cooling at relatively good efficiencies. That's true in other jurisdictions as well. New Brunswick is unique. Pathways to net zero, both in Canada and internationally, see similar trends. Next slide. Transportation sees a similar shift. We see the growth of electric vehicles to 2030 and beyond to 2050, replacing internal combustion vehicles. In fact, the data is showing that the real world sales are already outpacing these sort of trends. So like many projections, we have been more pessimistic rather than optimistic than what is actually bearing out. And again, that's a reflection on how quickly the costs of low carbon and net zero technologies are declining over time. Next slide. I think really important to take an economic perspective here as well. In this case, I'm looking at the cost of energy services to New Brunswickers. That's what they're paying for gasoline to fuel their vehicles, for heating fuels to heat their homes. And most notably on pathways to net zero, on all these pathways to net zero, the trend is downward. People are spending less in New Brunswick on energy services over time as a share of the total income. That's partly because income is growing, the economy is still growing, people are still making more and doing better over time, but it's also because of energy efficiency, using less energy. It's because of those technologies becoming cheaper and easier to deploy over time as well. Next slide. I want to highlight a trend that cuts across all of those last three slides, and it's the importance of the electricity system. And electricity systems in New Brunswick, but again elsewhere as well, are really the backbone of net zero pathways in lots of ways. Clean electricity, clean, reliable electricity allows for that fuel switching that you saw in those previous slides. It allows for the switch to electric vehicles, the switch to heat pumps in a way that is consistent with achieving net zero pathways and net zero objectives. That being said, that puts a pressure on to make sure that the electricity system can supply that additional electricity as it needs to, when it needs to, can supply it in a way that is reliable and flexible enough to meet the fact that that renewables are not producing electricity at exactly the same time all the time. And it reflects the need to keep an eye on rate pressures as well, to make sure that we are building electricity systems that can meet that greater demand without creating pressure on rates, without creating pressure on income of people in New Brunswick, especially lower income people. We have more work coming on this piece. This is a sort of teaser for your staff, a new work coming this spring on this work. Next slide. I'll conclude with a few recommendations on policy implications for net zero. Fundamentally, these transitions don't happen without policy. They don't happen on their own. They need policy to internalize externalities. They need policy to drive these changes. And that really means we're still talking about increasingly stringent carbon pricing, increasingly stringent regulations across all parts of the economy. Critical that these policies are designed well, that they are covering all emissions, that they aren't creating perverse incentives, that they are as cost effective and as flexible as possible. New Brunswick's made some recent progress there in adjusting its carbon pricing systems, for example, to make sure that carbon prices aren't increasing while gas prices are decreasing, or that exemptions in that carbon pricing system don't create loopholes. There's a strong case for accountability mechanisms, for holding governments and future governments to account by requiring them to build plans to deliver emissions reductions, to meet milestones and steps, not just over the next 3 years, but over the next 30 years, to deliver these long-term objectives. The federal government has done this legislation. Other provinces are starting to do the same thing by relying on legislated plans and legislated processes to deliver transparent plans to drive emissions reductions. Next slide, please. I'll finish with the third research stream that we call clean growth. And ultimately, achieving emissions reductions is a means to an end. It's a means to protecting the prosperity and well-being of New Brunswickers and Canadians in the long term. Next slide. Notably, New Brunswick has seen sharp emissions reductions since 2005, and it in fact leads Canada in terms of those emissions reductions. But it's also notable that New Brunswick's GDP has grown much slower than the rest of Canada. The best way to reduce emissions reductions is not by growing less quickly or by losing parts of the economy that produce emissions, is instead to transition towards economies that are less emissions intensive, or as the figure shows, that produce more GDP or units of output or income per emission produced. On that front, New Brunswick has some opportunities, but also some challenges ahead of it. There is a need to make sure that it is growing the economy while also reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and doing both at the same time. Next slide, please. We released this report earlier this year, and it explored maybe the biggest threat to prosperity on pathways to 2050. And it is not from domestic policy, it is from international market shifts, international changes in emissions policy and climate policy, and an action towards walking those net zero pathways. International action could have huge implications for domestic trade and domestic production. And that's true in Canada, and it's true in New Brunswick as well. These scenarios, these different scenarios that are on the screen, highlight the range of possibilities that could bound what happens internationally. Next slide, please. our analysis tracked those international trends, those international shifts into domestic activity. And we discovered that there are big opportunities for producing things that are consistent with those scenarios, but also big risks for those sectors that are not yet transition ready, that are not yet prepared for those international market shifts. Next slide. This slide is the most important one on this research, so I'll spend a minute here. Really, three categories of sectors emerge from that analysis. There are those international shifts are creating more demand for product, and those are opportunity sectors. There are the challenges to enable those firms and those sectors to grow, to meet growing international demand. There are carbon cost sectors. These are sectors like industrial sectors that are emissions intensive. There are the challenges to make sure that they can reduce their emissions and the emissions embedded in their goods as cost effectively and as easily as possible. And there are demand decline sectors. There are sectors that are producing things for which there may be less demand in the future internationally. The Bank of Canada released a new study this week looking at exactly this question. It found very similar results as to ours, and it highlighted, in fact, refineries and refined petroleum products as one of the most threatened sectors under international emissions trends. That has obviously big implications for a province like New Brunswick, which has a big part of its economy in refineries in the Irving refinery.
Excuse me.
Yes.
The 20 minutes have concluded. If you can work in the remainder of your presentation and the answers to the questions, that would be wonderful.
I can do that.
Okay, great. Thank you. So we're going to move to the question period. And on va commencer avec Monsieur Lagacé.
Thank you, Mr. President. And thank you, Mr. Bugan, for your presentation. Before I ask you a question, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you to send my regards to Kathy Brunswick. You're a wonderful CEO. She's a very competent CEO. First question, in your publication, including your annual report, you referenced legislating accountability to reach climate goals. Based on your knowledge of New Brunswick's climate change legislation and policies, where do you see room for improvement for us to bring to our report?
The fundamental goal of those accountability frameworks is to bring more certainty. It is to reduce the chances of swings in government planning, in government policy, and to create consensus around those net zero pathways. So the best practices are to start mapping out transparent requirements for reporting on carbon budgets on 5-year intervals. So that means setting out requirements for transparent reporting about what New Brunswick will achieve by 2025, by 2030, and then on to 2035 and 2040. So there's both a transparency function, there is a future foresight function here about extending the time horizon. And the third piece I'll add is baking in independent advice and independent expertise to making sure that those milestones and that target setting process are informed not just by political and government processes, but also by independent expert processes as well.
Okay, thank you. Have you had a chance to go over the climate change plan?
I have, and my team has, although I look at all of them, so I have not all the details quite at my fingertips all the time, but I have indeed.
So is there any of the recommendations or goals that were set out, anything that you would like to see us change or beef up or put more energy on?
I think ultimately it's the policy stringency that's going to matter most. It's going to be the stringency of policy to deliver on those emissions reductions. So I think there's more work to do in terms of some of the policy levers that I've talked about here today, in terms of driving those emissions reductions plans, driving those emissions transitions pathways.
Okay. In your presentation, I believe the first part around resilience, you mentioned some cost-effective investments that could be done. Could you give some examples of some of those that could be done?
Yeah, I'm flipping to a slide here. Excuse me a second. One of the most cost-effective ones are changing the way that roads are repaired. So it's the kind of materials used for roads, the replacement processes used to do so, and preparing those roads for swings in climate to make them more resilient to buckling and degradation. That avoids the costs of having to replace them prematurely. It avoids the cost of disruptions to transportation. There's some more specifics in this report that I will flip to Patrick afterwards on the details of those replacement processes. But in terms of a broad category, that's one very strong example.
Is there any other jurisdiction in Canada that is currently using those methods?
Good question. I don't know the answer. I'll circle back on that one too.
Be interesting to find out. So again, on adaptation, that seems like, I guess, you know, is there any other large priority that we could target for? I guess it's still in the section of resilience.
There's more work to be done here as well. This lets me slip ahead a little bit, 2 slides I didn't quite get to, in terms of sustainable finance and mobilizing financial capital and private capital, both to resilience as well as to net zero pathways. And there's a clear role for requiring disclosure of financial risk, both from those transitions risks from international progress and net zero pathways, but also from climate risk. And that Bank of Canada study I alluded to starts to talk about the need for securities regulators to require disclosure of both climate risk and transition risk. That is a shared jurisdiction question. There are provincial regulators that need to cooperate with national regulators to start to mobilize private capital by showing to shareholders very clearly where risk lives in the future.
Okay. I was going through your website and your annual reports. Do you have any partnerships or staff or any links with New Brunswick organizations?
Let me see. One of our experts, Maria Panezzi, is a New Brunswick professor. I believe she's in Moncton, although I could be wrong about that. We partner with the Clean Foundation, which is in Nova Scotia, but tries to have Atlantic level activities, Atlantic level research as well. So they connect us to New Brunswick activities. I think that may be all.
Okay, thank you. In your slide of, and I forget the title, but you were talking about Wildcards and I believe Sure Things. One that I did notice in Wildcards that everybody else seems to be bringing up, just because there's so much discussion around it, is small modular reactors. Is there any reason why you're not targeting or looking at that aspect?
I think we should count SMRs as a wildcard technology. Modeling is really useful in terms that it constrains your ability to go beyond what is reasonable and to think within a consistent framework, but it's also limited in terms of data availability. When we did this analysis more than a year ago, we didn't have great data on SMRs, and so we excluded it from our analysis. We qualitatively discussed in that paper that SMRs could be delivering some of that firm electricity load that's embedded in those pathways. But you're right to highlight it as a specific example that could contribute to meeting that net zero electricity system that I talked about as being so important. We shouldn't think of it as a safe bet. There is still uncertainty about the timing and costs of delivering that kind of technology at scale, but I think it is an important wildcard.
Okay, and you mentioned future studies, or there's studies coming out soon about energy generation, I think. Will that be part of it?
Yeah, that study has 2 main parts. One, it looks at what a net zero consistent electricity system might be, and again uses that wildcard safe bet framework as a framing device, but takes a closer look at some specific technologies, including nuclear, including SMR, and essentially finds that the electricity system in all regions has to be bigger, has to be cleaner, has to be more flexible, and there is some variable ways to do that, but that those fundamentals are avoidable. It also talks about the policy levers to actually deliver that electricity system, that net zero electricity system, and starts to explore the need to drive climate policy faster and more assertively, but also to change the way regulators think about electricity systems.
Thank you, Mr. Bugan. Mr. President, that was all my questions. I believe MLA Leblanc has some questions.
Okay, merci, Monsieur Leblanc.
Thank you, Mr. Bugan. Good afternoon. And in the essence of time, I'd like for you to explain us the 4 recommendations and go into detail. I know that at the end of their presentation, you didn't have enough time, but there's good recommendations there, and I'd like you to drill down and give us some information into detail. Thank you.
Let's go to slide 24, and thanks for the opportunity to make up some time. Really appreciate it. So this imperative to grow the economy while achieving these climate things is so important. And that means that government decisions need to be thinking not just about competitiveness now, but competitiveness in the future. And that means being really cognizant that what is competitive now may not be the same thing as what's competitive in the future. And it's embedding that long-term competitiveness directly in your government decision-making frame. That will play out in terms of rebalancing where public dollars are going or not going. And there's a pretty strong case for shifting away from providing public policy support to those demand decline sectors. Even if they are a source of prosperity now, if they aren't going to be in the future, then that's an important challenge. Again, this is about people, and that some of these big transitions where some sectors are declining in output and production, that has big implications for workers. And it's not enough just to say that some sectors are growing, some sectors are shrinking. Governments, including New Brunswick's, should be thinking about that transition and thinking about how to make that transition smooth, not just at a macroeconomic perspective, but at a human level as well. And that means thinking about communities, it means thinking about retraining, it means thinking about how you are spreading around the benefits of the transition as well as the costs. And as I said before, mobilizing capital by making these risks transparent to businesses is a key part of that story too.
Okay, merci beaucoup.
Thank you.
Mr. Kuhn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good afternoon, Mr. Bugan. Thank you for your presentation, your recommendations. I've got some specific questions on recommendations. You said that climate risks need to be embedded throughout government decision-making. Well, we're MLAs, so this is something of interest. So how would you recommend, or what approaches are you familiar with where this has been done that actually achieves that kind of embedding of climate risks throughout decision making when still governments are structured with a lot of silos?
Yeah, great question. A few things to add here. So we put a short piece recently that I didn't allude to on whole of government thinking when it comes to net zero and it thinks to climate risks. And that speaks to best practices about creating processes and creating connections between departments rather than in those silos. So there's lots to unpack there, but there's some best practices in international experiences about governance structures that can make a difference. I will send that paper to the clerk as well for you to look at it in more detail and follow up if you'd like. The other thing I will add is this idea of climate lenses, that whether it is treasury boards or financial decision-making parts of government have an explicit mandate to think about those costs and benefits in a broader sense, and that too often government decisions are based on pretty narrow definitions of cost and very narrow definitions of benefits, and forcing those decisions and those cost-benefit analysis to explicitly think about climate risks, even though those economists tend not to have a deep understanding of climate scenarios, or to think about competitiveness changes in the face of uncertainty and those international shifts is one way to start to embed those different sets of risks and opportunities in that decision as well. Part of that is moving beyond very narrow cost and benefit, but thinking about scenario analysis explicitly, thinking about how decisions hold up, not under one specific set of circumstances and assumptions, but under a full range of them, and testing decisions across different climate threats and different climate scenarios, but also different global scenarios as well. So you can see the connection to both of those pieces of work that I presented.
Thank you. Similarly, and we've already heard this earlier, that there's a lot of information out there that is not available in this province. You're saying it's important to make and require information to be transparent to support better decision-making and to mobilize private capital. So again, are there institutional mechanisms that you've seen which would ensure that relevant information is readily available?
So a few different examples to draw on. There's lots, but a couple specifics. The flood mapping really does come up again and again and again as a really essential way to manage infrastructure risk. So kudos to New Brunswick for moving ahead on that front. There are other risks that we can start to provide information as well, whether it is mapping heat risk or whether it is mapping extreme weather, providing information and advanced warning about weather systems. The federal government is starting to collate and collect climate data to allow private sector actors and other governments to start to do some of that scenario analysis as well. So that central repository of easily available climate scenario information is another thing that can be useful, especially when provincial governments such as New Brunswick can provide that context-specific and detailed resolution where it's possible.
Thanks. With respect to your safe bets graph and wildcards, you have something here. Maybe you could explain. It's RNG first generation under safe bets for 2030 and RNG second generation as a wildcard for 2050. What's this referring to?
RNG is renewable natural gas. So it is a replacement for methane in natural gas. So you can use it in natural gas distribution systems to heat homes, natural gas furnaces, but rather than methane mined geologically as methane produced from manure waste or from woody waste or from even landfills in some cases. So first generation is existing sources of that. It's mostly kind of farm oriented. Second generation are sources that are not yet competitively at scale, tend to be more woody waste producing that second generation RNG. The second generation tends to work better, be a better substitute, and a more complete solution to net zero.
So I'm aware, now that I know what the acronym stands for, that Montreal is heavily gone into renewable natural gas production. Would you consider them being engaged with first generation or second generation?
I don't know the specifics, so I'll beg ignorance on it.
Okay, all right, that's fine. With regard to electricity systems, you say energy institution and regulation is not aligned with net zero. Can you elaborate on that a little bit and what alignment might look like?
Yes, so I'm trying not to get too ahead of where my research has gone so far in terms of public stuff, but I'll give a little elaboration at least. Utilities spend lots of time planning for reliability and for low cost, and the regulators of utilities really have created that mandate that that's the objective to deliver those things. That planning process becomes harder in the face of uncertain net zero transitions, where future policy is not yet clear, where future policy is not yet defined. And as a result, sometimes utilities are planning for not net zero futures. They're planning for futures where policy, in fact, does not follow the trajectories that I've talked about to walk those net zero pathways. And that in itself can create inertia, making it harder to walk those pathways. British Columbia is an example here, where the utilities, BC Hydro, is explicitly planning for worlds that are not consistent with net zero pathways. So that's a challenge in governance of electricity systems across lots of provinces and within lots of provinces.
Okay, thank you for that. The other question was around refineries. So what do you see? What do you see refineries looking like through this transition? You know, I had the same question a while ago and met with officials from Irving Oil to pose it to them. And they kind of have a long-term plan. They're thinking long-term, but what's your sense of how refineries will change through this transition?
It's a hard question because it's an uncertain question, and there aren't. I don't have a crystal ball exactly what will happen. All I can do is point to the pressures that are going to exist on those firms to be profitable in the long term. And I can say that if the world, the rest of the world, really does tackle climate change in a serious way, that will have big implications for the future demand for oil products. If the transition to electric vehicles continues to accelerate even faster than my model projections think they will, that will have big implications domestically and internationally for demand for oil and therefore the price of oil. So there are, I can't say for sure exactly what those things are going to be, but I can say that if those futures come to pass, that will put serious pressure on the profitability of facilities such as the Irving refinery.
So you don't see them morphing into some other kind of business lines?
I hope that they do, and in fact, I wouldn't even pretend to know exactly what that morphing should do. That's exactly the role of the private sector, that they should be seeing the market trends, they should be seeing the policy incentives, both currently and that are coming, and making their own decisions to prosper into the future. So if there is transformational opportunities for the refinery, that is a good news story.
Then finally, you talked about the need for government policy to account for long-term competitiveness. So what kind of recommendation would you make for government to consider in terms of figuring out how to contemplate what long-term competitiveness looks like through a transition? It seems quite unpredictable, obviously, and yet is there help for governments who might be struggling with that very thing?
I think the key there, again, is uncertainty analysis. It is scenario analysis. It is not pretending with total certainty that our projections are right, or with hubris that our projections are right. It is recognizing those futures might go in a range of directions, and then trying to make sure that government decisions are robust across those decisions. So that does come back to changing the way governments do cost-benefit analysis. It does come back to scenario analysis, just as I have produced and my team has produced with that report, Sink or Swim, that I drew on for some of the results here. And I hope that that analysis that we produce can be the kind of tool that helps governments do exactly that and think about future competitiveness as well as historical competitiveness.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kuhn. Mr. Austin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I actually don't have any questions for Mr. Bugan. I do want to thank him, though, for his presentation and look forward to hearing more. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Ms. Bacchus.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Bugan, for being here today. I must confess, I really do need you to explain something to me. In your report, you were talking about the health costs of climate change and how they're changing. And I can understand how climate change can contribute to decreased productivity and health-related deaths, but how does it contribute to an increase in Lyme disease?
Great question, and I'm glad for the chance to elaborate. So climate change is making new ecosystems, they're changing those ecosystems, and therefore it's changing the environments in which ticks can survive. And Lyme disease is transmitted by ticks, often carried by deer. And so a change in climate is causing Lyme disease carrying ticks to be prevalent and present in more locations than it used to be. And as a result, it increased incidence of Lyme disease.
Because we have had a few occurrences here in southwestern New Brunswick, and we've had, seminars and things on the transmission, and I've been told that it was birds that bring it up the coast, and then they drop off the birds and they go into the woods and whatever. So that's all connected.
So I will confess that I'm an engineer and economist, not a biologist. So I will beg some some lack of full information on exactly the system.
Okay.
But there's a pretty good basis of literature that my team has explored pretty carefully about how ticks are more prevalent in a warming climate. So that's grounded in pretty good data.
Okay. No, I just found that very interesting, that part of it. And also too, I found it interesting that you were basing your opinion on SMR on research perhaps that you had received about a year ago. I'd offer to extend an invitation to you to reach out to the Department of Natural Resources and Economic Development for their updated information, which shows that I think SMRs are the way to go. But anyway, that's just an invitation I'm extending to you.
Appreciate that. I've had a few conversations with nuclear people in the last few months with similar kind of opinions that technology is changing fast. And let's be clear, not all wildcards stay wildcards forever. That's the nature of wildcards.
Yeah, but I'm sure you'd want to be up to date on it, so I thought I'd extend that invitation.
Thank you.
So thank you, Mr. Chair. That's all I have.
Thank you, Ms. Bacchus. Thank you very much, Mr. Bugan, for your presentation this afternoon. I'll give you an opportunity now to provide any closing comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, committee. Let me reiterate again that I really appreciate the time. I really appreciate the chance to share a little window into our research. I will forward some of the detailed reports along for you to unpack and for the clerk to draw on as need be. Let me conclude by saying that this transition is a story that's not just about cost and risks. This transition is a story that should also be about opportunity and growth and prosperity. And I was pleased to hear the questions and elaboration on future competitiveness. This is a transition that, under the right policy circumstances, can grow New Brunswick success stories, can create new emergent success stories as well that are poised to thrive, both in a domestic net zero transition, an international low carbon transition, but also a warming climate. And that getting ahead of those shifts and being cognizant of those risks and those possible futures now is really the way to thrive through them. So I appreciate the time to help you develop policy to do all those things.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for your presentation. Again, I hope that you have a wonderful afternoon.